Hello, class. On to chapter 13, which is all about unions and collective bargaining. And it's a really an interesting chapter because, the chances are, I'm sure for the most of you, you are not in a unionized workforce. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, unionization saw its peak in the U.S., where about 35 to 40% of all workers in the U.S. were unionized. And in some areas, it was 50, 60%. But now, as we sit here in 2023, literally those numbers are probably less than 10%. I think maybe only 7 to 8% nationwide of employees are unionized. But that given said, just because unionization has declined significantly in the U.S. doesn't mean it's not important for us to at least understand some of the basics about unions and collective bargaining. And again, the whole idea of collective bargaining is so that you band together with several employees and you speak as a group. You have one voice to talk about wages, terms, conditions of employment, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole idea behind collective bargaining is kind of the whole idea of strength in numbers, where you can have more of a stronger voice of more individuals are speaking together. So, and what kind of started all of this, way back in the early part of the 20th century was the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. Again, it's probably there's a lot of laws and acts and rules associated with unions and collective bargaining, but probably the most important and the one that I would definitely want you to know is the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. And more specifically, if you go to page 497 of your textbook, there's a section on employee rights under the National Labor Relations Act. There's actually, I think, 6 of them listed. Make sure that you know what those 6 are for test purposes, because again, those are really under this law. All private employees have the rights. Those 6 things that are listed. Public employees, so if you work for the government, or certain like universities and things like that, those are slightly amended. That's kind of outside the scope of this class, and I don't want to bore you with those details. But just know for page 497, the employee rights under the National Labor Relations Act. And obviously employees will exercise their rights, and companies and organizations have certain rules that they have to follow in regards to this as well. So if you skip ahead to page 514, it discusses what we call ULPs, or unfair labor practice. And ULPs are essentially, what unions and employees cannot do, essentially. So there's a separate section for what would be an unfair labor practice for employers, so for the company, as well as for labor organizations. A lot of people think that, only, companies can violate federal labor law. It's not true. Employees, as well as their unions, can also violate federal labor law if they engage in any of the incidences that occur, again, on page 514. So make sure you know that information as well. So skip ahead to around page 529, and we're going to start talking about union organizing, the process that goes about actually how we organize unions. Now, to give you an idea of how complex, this is, and actually for chapter 13 as a whole, so I teach a separate class at a different university, and the whole class is on unions and collective bargaining. And we spent, in a 16-week semester, we probably spend 4 or 5 weeks just on union organizing alone. So there's an incredible amount of information to know. And again, for purposes of this class, I only want you to know the basics, but page 529 does a good job of kind of describing what goes into union organization. So it's been there, and there's really 2 things that I want you to know in that area specifically. One is about establishing the appropriate bargaining unit, because a union can't just come in and say, okay, everybody who works here outside of management is going to be part of our union. They have to specify which individual employees and which individual job titles are part of their bargaining groups. Because in a lot of places, in a big manufacturing company, for example, maybe the machinists are organized, and maybe the line workers and maybe the janitors, for example, are unionized. But maybe the accountants aren't organized, or the marketing individuals, or the cafeteria workers, maybe they're not organized. So we have to figure out what is the appropriate group that we're looking at. And then once that is established, to be able to even have an election to be able to establish whether or not there's going to be a union, there has to be what we call authorization cards. And so at least 30%, that is the key number here, 30% of the bargaining unit has to sign a card that says, yes, I would be interested in having a union. I want to vote on this. So if a union can get at least 30% of the employees in that bargaining group to agree to sign their card, they can have an election. And in that election, the group will vote whether or not they want a union or not. But if they don't get at least 30% to sign those cards, then they can't even have an election. So that'll be a really important test question. So make sure you know that 30% is the number. So again, I love this stuff because, like I said, I deal with this in my job regularly. And again, I teach a separate class on it, but there's just so much to this chapter. So really, again, not to overwhelm you and to help focus on what are the really key aspects of this chapter. The last part I want to talk about is the duty to bargain in good faith. So often, let's just say that a union has been established and the two parties are negotiating to try to create a contract. There is no legal requirement that the two sides agree to anything. You are, whether you're the union or management, you're never required to agree to everything, to anything at all, really. However, you are required to bargain in what we call good faith. You have a duty to bargain in good faith, which means you can't just show up at the meeting and just sit there, and la 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 la, and play on your phone. That's not bargaining in good faith. You have to actively be discussing, ways to try to find an agreement on certain things. So, and again, so often the biggest misconception is once a union is established that there has to be a contract. There doesn't, and sometimes organizations and companies can go years from the moment that the union is established to the moment that they actually agree to a contract, because they're not required to agree to anything, either side. But that duty to bargain in good faith is always part of it, at least willing to engage in conversations and trying to find a way to compromise. That is the key with that. So, and there's a couple things that can happen. Obviously, there can come a point where there's an impasse, where neither side can agree, and so it's kind of like a stalemate, if you will. So it's called an impasse. And each side has tools to kind of, even when a contract is established, to kind of move the needle one way or the other. Obviously for most of us, we've heard about strikes, where a union will go out on strike because they're demanding higher wages or they're demanding better working conditions. But management has the same option as well. They can do what's called a lockout, where they can literally tell the workers, we're locking the doors and you cannot come back in until we agree to this. So there's all these different little tools like this that both unions and management can use to try to create a better situation in a collective bargaining agreement. So again, I love this stuff, and I could talk about this forever and ever and ever. But again, what we just described for chapter 13 are the main points that I want you to know. So if you understand all that, then I think you understand probably 80% of all the really hardcore information about unions and collective bargaining. So well done. So, all right, well, that's it for this chapter, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks.